My friends, this is Noah Fredericks. This tape is going to be dealing with what I've entitled the Nicodemus Preachers. Today we'll wonder why we're in the dark. I maintain we're still in the dark ages as a whole. No wonder Christ called people the sheep. There is nothing as dumb as sheep. And unfortunately, we have this herd instinct. But in the old days, when they were going to take the sheep to the slaughter, they had a lead goat that would lead them to the slaughter pens. And today, we're being led by a goat, or goats, shall we say. We just want to go along with whatever we see in the newspapers, on the glass toilet and whatever. All of this censored news, we're in the dark, we're lost as to who we are, from whence we came, and where we're going, and why we're here. As we get into this, I've touched lightly on it before about Nicodemus. But in this chapter, now this is going to be so far out, but my friends, at least hear my evidence on why we claim these outlandish statements. I'm going to try my very best to give you all of the clues that I can. But you have to remember, as we said before, I've got to repeat myself here. I always try to do a little background work, and I try to lead people gently into this. This is not for everybody to understand. Eventually, everybody will. But it'll all be over but the shouting, so to speak. We're going to deal with Nicodemus. Now, I understand that Nicodemus, he was a Pharisee, and he was in the priesthood. And you remember at the time of Christ, as we read through the books of John, and especially the 8th chapter, where Christ complained about, he says, you who sat in the seat of Moses. In other words, the hierarchy of the church and the political faction had been taken over by some people who sat in the place of Moses and had replaced the laws, the commandments, the statutes, the judgments, and so forth that was handed down from heaven. Literally, the 10 Commandments, I think, and all the others, the Deuteronomy and the Levitical laws had been given to Moses to bring back to the people, to set up a priesthood and keep the people from going into error. This was once again being ignored by the people. Because Nicodemus, in my opinion, I think there's a great possibility that he truly was not an Israelite. Even though you go back, you take the word Yehudim, meaning those who came out of the captivity from Babylon. So we don't know about his genealogy because it becomes quite apparent. Well, like Christ said to many of them in his day, you do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of the Almighty. But how did we get lost? Let me go back and give you, I don't think I've used this one before, but we go back, we find the first Archbishop, Argobard. He said the Bible was not released until whole sections had been mutilated during mass translation. Now, according to Eric Norman, he was the author, you might have read his book, of God's Demons and UFOs. And so then, to further substantiate a lot of our evidence, I'd like to take you back to a set of books that I thought was extinct for many years. It's a 10-volume set, and I won't bother to quote from any of it right now, but it's one of the most fantastic books. And people talk about the Dark Age, and you ask about most people, when did our ancestors slip into this Dark Age? In other words, truth was blacked out. When did this happen? Well, these 10 volumes that are entitled The Ante-Nicene Fathers. Now let me explain it. That means before the Nicene Council. When this priestcraft rose to an apex, that they had the power of the government behind them, and they were willing to share that power. because they knew that every race and nation on the face of the earth since time immortal had to have some sort of religion, and it's one of the greatest ways of controlling the people. As this Nicene Council, others, they come up with this idea of purgatory. Not only could they scare the hell out of you, but if they had control of your immortal soul, then rather than lose your soul and burn in some Dante's Inferno, you would go along with them. But these 10 volumes that I'm speaking of, they're a collection of the writings of the first Christian writers from the period about 25 AD to 325 AD. Now the term anti-Nicene Fathers means before the Nicene Council, which came into power, and I mean power, like the Bible talks about the whore that rides on the beast. In other words, it's talking about a false whore religion that goes along with the government and power so they can share the power and wealth and control and all of that. This came about in 325 AD. Now it was right shortly after that, it seemed that all of Christendom was plunged into a spiritual blackout, which was called and still is called the Dark Ages. The writings of these men reveal that they were the greatest and the most reliable writers of that age, or any other age. They were tried and true saints, and they were fired with a grim determination to spread the gospel and also the deity of Jesus the Christ, and many of them died a martyr's death rather than deny that he was the true God in form of man. Except the writers of Scriptures, no writers have ever lived that compared with them. Many of them saw and they heard Jesus, and some of them they saw and they heard the 12 disciples, and some of them they heard and met with the 70 apostles sent out by Jesus. Now, I've just recently been able to find a contact for these, and I'm not trying to promote them to anybody that can't afford them. They are very expensive, and these 10 volumes, they cost $249. And anybody that might be interested in ordering them through me, I would ask you to add 10% of the cost for shipping, because that's what they charge me. And so I would say if you're a real student and you want your eyes open to revelations and understanding and great historical fact and the truest form, I hate to use the word religion, but of the Christian religion and understanding until it went into the spiritual blackout. But what we're going to be dealing with in this chapter, I think we can prove conclusively. And we're going to have to break it down into several parts here, where we're not going to start just exactly with Nicodemus, but see, this is where the church world got off on this tangent about born again. And here in the South and the Midwest, we hear these preachers say born again. Now, my friends, don't shut me off. Hear me out. I believe that as a Christian, you have to be obedient. You have to be baptized. Like Paul said, what must I do to be saved? He was told by Ananias, you must repent and be baptized. We know, we understand it, so I'm not ridiculing. I only ridicule the ignorance that is passed on by these preachers that would have you believe that you're just a dead man and you don't have a spirit and you're walking around without a spirit, and that you have to go up to their wooden altar and you have to make a personal public confession that you accept Jesus Christ. Well, lucky Jesus Christ, you accept him. They would have you think that he's waiting over there in the corner and he's not going to get on with his business and he can't do anything until you accept him. Well, I know a lot of these things, when I first heard them, they upset me, and it took me many years to get over all of that old religion that had been ground into me. So what I'm going to say, my friends, it's not going to take away from the Bible. It's not going to take away your salvation. But it's going to show you what a great and real and understandable salvation that you really do have. Now, we're going to show you by Scripture What has been lost through the translation and the Nicene Council and people interfering with the Bible. We'll show you what has been lost, where all of these people would have us believe that all of God's angels are neutered and there's no reproductive organs, and this is nonsense. It just means a messenger. We've pointed out how Ezekiel and how John of Revelations, both of them give the same testimony of throwing himself prostrate before these angels, if you like, or messengers, and they told him, get up, men, don't do this. We're your brethren. We're of the same household. We're your kinfolk. Don't do this. Don't worship this. That they were servants of the Almighty just like you and I. And we're going to find out that so many people, they're taught, like these preachers, they go to a graveside service, and ashes to ashes and dust to dust. If heaven won't have you, some other place must. And then they stand there and they tell the poor folks, the grieving people who are left behind, that your spirit or soul has left the body and you're now in heaven with God and His angels. Well, my friend, that's not what the Scripture says. Because what are we going to do? Does that soul or that spirit have to come back to this earth and join again with a body in the resurrection? Because Christ coming back again, as I think we've pointed out, there's a second resurrection. And there's the prophets of old. They prophesied of the resurrection. And they said that there was a day coming. They knew that they would stand once again in their flesh and with the eyes of flesh, and they would again see the Almighty. And He tells us, we're going to see here in a little bit, that we're going on to populate the universe, because how else, as we'll read the Scripture here from Genesis, where Moffat brings it out, that the Almighty said, we will be as plenteous as the dust of the earth that makes up the earth. Who could count that? Trillions and billions and zillions. There's no way of describing how many people will be in the house of the Almighty, and it seems through reproduction. Now, if this sounds far out, we're going to prove to you here about a fellow in the Bible who I think we can prove conclusively, as we've shown others, that went to outer space literally to get their brides. So we find today, now this is not a blanket statement against all preachers and teachers of the gospel. Now some of us are in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and some of us have gone to college, and some of us are working on master's degrees and BA degrees, and everybody is in a different degree or level. So, my friends, if I wanted to be popular, if I wanted to get out there and beg for tithes and offerings and say, oh, I need help with I need a new copy machine, or I need a new big house, or all of these, but my friends, I would have to drop this line that I'm going with. I'd be very to be more popular, but I'm not looking for popularity. I'm not looking for masses. I'm looking for quality, not quantity. And I'm trying to reach some of these people that are young and intelligent, but they will not buy the Bible. They won't buy history as it's presented by the ignorant and those in some esoteric religious fervor, and that are told by these proselyters, the Lord told me this, the Lord told me that. I used to wonder, I said, I must be a pretty bad guy because the Lord never speaks to me. But these preachers had me believe. They said, last night I was laying in bed and the Lord spoke to me. All right, my friends, maybe that wee still voice, maybe there was something in your genetics that is still hooked up to He in outer space. And when He stirs that within you and you fed something in your computer, then truth comes alive. But anyway, I better hurry along here. So, as I said, we're going to cover those who come from space and those who go to space, and how the Almighty tried to teach this old Nicodemus, you can't go back to heaven. You can't go back to my personal house and sit there among my kids if you didn't come out of that house. But due to erroneous translation, so we're going to cover a lot of interesting things I think we'll find will really excite you as it did me. So as I say today, a lot of the preachers, they're teaching Phariseeism, but only more confusing even than in the time of Nicodemus. Now, before I can explain why this chapter, this tape, we'll find these things have been hidden under the blankets of man's religious concept for 2,000 years. Let's study some background proof, as Christ said, that my people perish for lack of knowledge. Strong's Concordance shows hundreds of references for the word knowledge and its rejection. There have been millions who've gone by the way of the grave with the questions on their lips, such as, now, I don't know about you, maybe when you went through school you had to study all about these French Impressionists. Well, I consider myself an amateur artist. I've done oil paintings, sold a few of them, but you see, it was palmed off on me in my formative years that Gauguin, Renoir, Cezanne, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Vincent van Gogh, and Gauguin, and all of these, they were fantastic men, and they were, but my friends, all they were a bunch of liberal hippies of their day that didn't want to get a job at an honest endeavor, and they didn't have the talent to be anything like the great Dutch artists and those of Europe. And so they started this new style, and they tried to call it art. Well, in their lifetime, most of them never sold anything because people back then weren't so easily fooled. It took generations, and then some merchants ballyhooing it and saying this is art. Now that some of this, I consider it trash, is worth millions. But anyway, let's go back and we'll take this Gauguin. Now, he was imprisoned by the French, and his final tortured days were spent in Hawaii, and we find, if you read the history about him, he's over there asking all these stone gods. Well, in fact, one of his last canvases, or I think it was the last canvas he ever did, he in his insane fervor, he wrote across it, because he was eat up with syphilis and so forth, he wrote, "What are we? Where do we come from, and where are we going?" Now that was the question we found on his lips that had been unanswered for this poor soul up to the last month prior to his death, which was brought about by syphilis and an early attempt to commit suicide with arsenic. And he was a super alcoholic. I'm not condemning the man. He condemned himself. I feel very sorry for him. But he was devoid of morals and answers, and so consequently turned to booze and drugs and sex. So you see, in every man's soul there's an empty void there that he has to fill with something in order to tolerate life itself. Now we find in earlier tapes, I believe we've quoted about Abraham and his search for a city, though he said the maker and the builder was God, Yahweh, but he concluded that the city that he searched for wasn't on this earth. Also, John of Revelations, he went there, said he saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, new, or in other words, different than this world. He also called it the mountain of God and his throne and his city, etc. Now, as we search through the so-called Greek mythology, we have to try to understand why did they write it in such a form. Because, my friends, eventually they decayed to such a decadent, immoral society. I believe that those in the know, this was the only way they had to preserve and to hide the real history, where, like, somebody gets on you about writing something bad about the Kennedys. They say, well, I didn't say the Kennedys. I was just writing about a wealthy political family that rose to power. This is all mythology, so they can't sue you. But you see such a definite parallel to the real truth there, it can't be denied. We've all seen those type of shows on TV. But anyway, let's go back to this Greek mythology. We find shadows that were creeping over the knowledge as it started to creep into obscurity, shall we say. Now, as we read of the Odyssey of Homer, with the hymns that were translated by Buckley on page 399, quoting, he goes on, "And most mighty are the chieftains of valor, revolving thy fiery circles in and among the seven wandering stars." Note, stars that wander, planets that revolve around the sun. Now, continue to quote, "Where thy flaming steeds ever uplift thee above the third chariot." Now, thy flaming steeds. We've covered in our chapter on Pegasus, where they knew it wasn't flying horses, but they called them the flying horses of heaven, these spaceships. And you'll note here about the third chariot, or like Paul said, the third heaven. Remember Paul, he spoke of the third heaven called the paradise of God. Remember paradise? We searched it back and we found out that it meant the garden of God, or Venus, or Lucifer's star, the star of light. Remember light when going back to Nicodemus, who never understood or saw the light of Christ's idiom or parable. Nicodemus missed the point. He either had not studied the prophets of the Old Testament, such as Amos, the oldest of the so-called minor prophets, as we're going to see later on. Then we have the translation of H. Evelyn White, Hesod, volume in the Leob Classical Library, and quote, who whirl your fiery spheres among the planets in their sevenfold courses through ether, wherein your blazing steeds bear you above the third firmament of heaven. Now, some great authors think that this hymn was even before Homer, Allen and Holiday and Sykes. Now, the sevenfold course, like the seven-candle obra holder that we saw in the tabernacle of the wilderness, remember that it was to be made an exact copy of things that were in heaven, and if the preachers ever took the time and the intestinal fortitude to study it out, they would understand these things. But they find that because most of the congregations of today, that they're such spiritual pygmies, that they're spiritually retarded because of the pastors failing to teach them in any real depth, and so they're afraid of losing the tithes and the love offerings of the people who, most of them, the elders will say, hey brother, just keep it simple and let's don't go too late on Sunday because the wife's got a big pot roast and I got to go home and have a fat attack. But anyway, as we search the writings of Lucian, he was an author of approximately the 2nd century. They seem to agree with the teachings of Homer as he writes on the science of astronomy. He said all that Homer said of Venus and Mars was that his passion is also manifestly composed from no other source than his knowledge of the science of astronomy. Indeed, the conjecture of Venus and Mars is what creates the poetry of Homer. Now, my friends, the present religious world never has and never will understand it until they take a path different than what they're trotting now. Because I think in future tapes we're going to bring out some fantastic things about Venus and also of Mars. This is not going to be just biblical, but historical and scientific. There's so much evidence coming forth that's pointing to a great picture here that we have never dreamed of, and the Bible speaks of it, but we've not understood it, and we've ignored it because of name changes and mistranslation. Now, all we have to do is go back for a century to Mexican history, and we see the truth was passed down till it reached the Indians, who lost the truth of Venus because they started offering human sacrifices to Venus that, as we said before, they call Quetzalcoatl. Also, among other things, they called it the god of winds and flames of fire. Now, their description reminds us also of the Greeks' description of Venus. They also called her the goddess of storm and fire. What is that old saying? Hell hath no wrath like that of a woman scorned. And we know that Venus is called by John, is called the bride of Christ, adorned as a bride. In other words, Christ is coming back for his bride, and so also he had some of his other brides there with him, a great multitude of people. And also, I think we've proved conclusively in other factors or chapters that this was a great space station that was able to leave its orbit and move and had firepower, and it was full of weapons and ships, and we proved this in our chapter on the pillars of space and so forth. But she could be a lady. The Greeks also called her the goddess of love. And we heard Christ use the expression, God is love and all of this and that. But also, when angered, this woman can be, as says the Greeks, they referred to her as the goddess of storm and fire. She could be hell on wheels, or wings, we should say. We find that the Roman imperial colonies called Venus, Lux, Divina, which meant loose divine, divine loose, the divine light. Here we see that they had slipped so far under the cloud of ignorance that they too had lost the truth. But let's go back and review biblical history that they distorted. One of the most misunderstood understood chapters of Genesis, which is because of poor translation, which the scribes and the priests, they changed drastically because of their lack of understanding. It was the transporting from earth to their original home from whence they came, of the prophets and the preachers and the teachers and the rulers of Yahweh. They lost all this. They lost the understanding and the inference to it that is found throughout Scripture. Now we find detailed explanation is found in the chapter on Jacob's stone as to why the Almighty's house was called a stone, a rock, and so forth. It was suggested that I should admit or omit the chapter Jacob's stone due to the fact that a lot of people of a particular group, they say they're non-denominational, but after a few years in business they became another denomination. I know a lot of people are going to become very upset with me, but you see, friends, I'm not out to win a popularity contest. And if in order to get along that I go along and perpetuate what I have found out is no longer the truth, even though I believed in it for a long period myself, and I used it as a witness to try to proselytize people. But if I go along with that, I am dishonest. And where the Scripture talks about the Holy Spirit witnessing to us and so forth, and it says the Holy Spirit will lead you into all truth, the true Spirit of the Almighty, which I believe resides in us, His offspring, His sons and His daughters. And if we go against that, because there is no forgiveness in this life or the next for lying about the truth of the Almighty. And so I'm not out to win a popularity contest except with the Almighty. And I believe the truth will stand for itself. But I think if we are man enough to put aside and say, golly, I was wrong, I think that it will lead us into a great, glorious truth that will pertain to us as individuals instead of lifting up somebody else who is not entitled to the throne. In other words, we have been given our inheritance away, glorifying and deifying a lot of these people that they're claiming are the very descendants of Jesus Christ and His family. Well, as they say, what are we, chopped liver? So if we don't go back and look at it again in a different light, in the light of truth and the evidence that's presented throughout the Scriptures and the history and the ancient peoples, then we're going to be kept out of the house of the Almighty. So this is a time to pull aside the veil that we might enter the Almighty's house. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of people suggested that I don't interfere with these people's belief that the royal family of England are crowned on the very Jacobean stone that Jacob spoke of. They would have us believe that it's the literal throne that they think that he anointed with oil. And so these people who sat on it in England, they have the right to rule or ruin. Now, at this time, without going into a lot of detail, we found Jacob's dream was actually not a dream. As I said before, I've become very suspicious of people who tell me about dreams. I do not deny that the Almighty spoke to, who was it, old Nebuchadnezzar in a dream, but I'm very suspicious. I run into a lot of people today. They say, well, the Lord spoke to me in a dream, and the Lord and I had a talk last night, and this is what He had to say to me. I used to be very jealous. I said, my goodness, he never talks to me. But my friends, a lot of times, I'm sure you have, I wake up in the morning, I'm thinking on a scripture, and then I finally see the light on something I never understood before. But this, my friends, is not Jacob's dream. Get your concordance out and try to prove me wrong. It's a reality of where he went and what he saw. Now, but you see, the translators, they could not believe in anybody taking any kind of a vehicle and going to outer space, much less to the house of the Almighty. So they had to shave and whittle, and they had to give us a counterfeit here with something that these dark age, carnal, spiritual pygmies could believe in, so they change it all to a dream. But if you read the thing, even though it's so corrupted and distorted, and you read it, there's a lot of details and facts in there that contradict the fact that it was a dream. Because it was not. It was a reality. A lot of times, my friends, all you have to do, as I think we've proved conclusively over and over again, all you have to do is change one word in there, and it can corrupt the whole sentence or a chapter and the whole, or maybe understand the whole Bible. You see, well, for example, we have Christendom, and those who claim to be of Christendom, they're divided between the people who believe that Jesus Christ was God incarnate. And then we have the other faction that they call the Trinities, or the Trinitarians, that they have three different gods they claim. I'm not going to get into their quarrel. I don't have time, my friend. Hey, this is the time to clean your lamp, get your wicks, and to go out to meet the bridegroom. And then you're going to have a lot of neighbors come at the last minute, just like they'll come to me and beg me for spiritual oil. And I said, honey, if you haven't filled up your lamp by now, I'm sorry, I've got no time for you. I've got to go meet the master. But anyway, so we find Jacob's dream in reality was not a dream, but it was something he saw and experienced and did and went to. That was so very real that I think we've proved in another tape where he went into a state of shock. In other words, as I said before, he was dumbfounded. So the translators, they rendered it dream. But we find that old Jacob here, that when he met with these extraterrestrial messengers and he went from Earth to another planet or place in outer space, you find that he went into a state of shock. Now we're going to give you clues to look for, which were left behind or left out of the King James Version and many other translations. Now we're going to present to you from the 28th chapter of Genesis from the James Moffat. Now, we're going to use most all of it, so a lot of people think that I didn't just skip lightly over, took it out of context. And we want to point out some facts first that have been long ignored in this chapter. It tells which one this Luz or City of Light is. The Farrar Fenton translation exemplifies another interesting point by telling us that it was Adam's planet or world or house or his original home planet. And if we carefully read the chapter, we see that the Almighty promised that he would eventually be returned to his original planet. Far-fetched as this sounds, my friends, hang in there with me and we shall prove it. Now, what did Christ really mean when he called his flock the light of this world? He said, you're the light of the world. He implied that they were to bring order and law to this planet as they were and are the children of the kingdom of the planet of Luz or light. Now then, in Genesis 28, we see some translations where it was changed to Bethel, the house of God, and his sons, who are described as the Elohim, the plural, meaning the sons of he or him, the Almighty, such as Adam kind. We've discussed the chapter at great length. We can't seem to help but believe that there's a great deal, or there was a great deal of travel that went on. I think, my friends, that spanned centuries there was still travel and commerce, believe that or not, between the different worlds. Travel between the great space station, as I call it, and Earth. Now you notice the word P-A-D-D-A-N, Padan Aram. Now it's used repeatedly in that chapter, 20th chapter of Genesis. Once again, we go to Strong's Concordance, and they admit that there was some change or hanky-pank with this word. If you want to get your concordance out, I'll save you a little time. 6307, Padan. That was called, but the pronunciation was Padan. Like we remember, Adam was called the Adon. The dawn, the morning star, the bright and morning star. Padan, from an unused root, meaning to extend. In other words, you have an extension to your house, an outer space. To extend a plateau, or they have Padan Aram from these same words, 758, the tableland of Aram. Now, you say, what does that mean? Let's think about what John said. He saw 12 foundations, 12 floors. And you remember in our chapter, I believe it was on pillars, and the description from the ancient language says a platform or a space station, something that can hover, descend, shoot off at angles, and so forth. Now, we find this part of this word here. They take you from 6307, 6308. They say Pada, P-A-D-A, and that's pronounced Pada, a prime root meaning to retrieve or deliver. Now, for those of you that may not have forgotten, and you know what really worries me and bothers me, and part of it's my fault, I should probably send out and say to the people, I will not sell these tapes out of order. Because a lot of people, they like some of my titles better than the other, and some of my titles that are probably innocuous, and they think, what's that? Like Womb of the Morning. I think that's, and people have no idea what I'm talking about, so they say, well, that doesn't look too exciting, so they don't order it. But that's the trouble. A lot of the folks that send for these tapes out of order, and all I do is convince them that I'm a kook. Because what they're actually doing is starting in the middle of a book, halfway or three-quarters of the way through. They don't have any of the past evidence that we build our case on. They say, oh, gosh, this is crazy. But remember back in Genesis, they used the word created, especially when it talks about the Almighty said He created the great whales. And I've heard a lot of young people throughout the years come up and ask me, well, what does the Bible say about the great dinosaurs? And I said, well, that's a very good question. You look up the word whale, and it says created. Now, the key word there, created, means dispatched. Where were they dispatched from? We talk about the trees and the different seeds and the plants. It said before they existed in this world. Well, where did they exist? They were transported from somewhere else. Compared to many of the planets of space, this is a new planet. But see, we can't think in terms of millions of years because we can't even think in the terms of 70 till suddenly it's about over. But anyway, I think we've proved in other chapters as this pertaining to a plateau, meaning or implying that it was a floor, a level, or a deck in a great space station, something that's high up and far out, and is reached only by an extended journey. Now, after the story got around that Earthmen that came here, they started to name geographical locations on this earth after the place from whence they came. Because remember, Abraham and some of the greatest prophets of old said they knew that they were pilgrims here on this earth. And they knew their stay was temporary. And we want to cite to you the fact. Now, let's take the two words. One of my listeners wrote to me and said, we wish you'd take a little time to go back over it and tell us what we've heard, review it, and put it all together in a condensed form. Maybe I should. And Sometimes I think I overkill. Sometimes I think I'm too repetitious, too simple, but it's hard to satisfy everybody. So let's go back and find this word, the two different words we have here. We have the Padan and Pada. Now, Pada, as it's pronounced, that word 6308, now let's put it together. It's a prime root to retrieve or deliver. In other words, to send out or bring back. And then we take the other word up here, the Padan. It means to extend a platform and so forth. And so, as we said, Adam was called the dawn, the bright, the dawn, the early in the morning star. So we put the two of them together. So it's talking about to deliver and to bring back a people, as I think we've pointed out in Revelation, talks about all kind of nations that will flow unto it in that day. I think that has been proven quite clearly in other of our tapes what a plateau is, meaning or implying a floor, a level, a deck of a space station, something that's high up, far out, and is reached only by an extended journey. Now, as we said before, after this story got around about Earthmen, that they started to name geographical locations on this earth after their original homestead or their place. Like the book of Jude says, those who kept not their first estate. Now, they had been discussing extraterrestrial planes and this place called the Padan Aram, as the prophet describes it, also as God's house. Here we are. Allow me to quote to you from Genesis 28 from the James Moffat Bible. I think he was a really fantastic author, and he devoted a whole lifetime going back and doing it over and over. And then he would go and ask a lot of these elders and all these critics. And finally, at one point, he said, look, boys, I've devoted my whole life to it. I quit if you want to change it. And then these liberal churches and these sorry preachers, they turn around, they let a Bible like the Moffat get away from us. Now, I understand it's back in print again. There's a lot of people that I've talked to heard of it, but I think it's right along there with Farrar Fenton. I enjoy both of them. So allow me to read from Genesis. So we'll start Genesis 1 of the 28th chapter and verses 22. And I think that it's important we cover most all this so you get how the story goes and we're not taking anything out of context here. So Isaac called Jacob and he blessed him and he gave him this charge. You're not to marry any Canaanite woman. Be up and off to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethel, your mother's father, and get a wife there. Now keep that in mind, Bethel. Remember Abraham, I think, and Jacob talk about in ancient times it was called the house of Luz. And I don't know any place on this earth that was ever called the house of Luz. But keep this in mind as we go along. I mean, they have tampered with this. Well, let's see if we can get some sense out of it. Bethel, your mother's father, and get a wife there among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you till you become a group of nations. My friends, if the premise that we're going to make is not true, then, my friends, they were diametrically opposed to God's genetical law because they were practicing incest there. But when they're talking about your house, your mother's house, your father's house, here he's talking about a great house in space. They were not breeding in that close in the family tree. These people were not a bunch of dunces. They knew about genetics. This is why that there was something in this Canaanite gene pool that they did not want in the blood of these Semitic people here mentioned. Now may he grant you and your descendants the blessings of Abraham, that you may own the land where you reside, the land of God gave to Abraham. At this time, we better ask you to please turn your tape over to side 2. Let's see, on the other side we left off. Let's see, it was around the 4th verse of Genesis 28. Now, my friends, a lot of people think very small, so they're thinking of geographical areas. And there was only certain areas of the earth that was to be given to this Semitic man. But the scripture says that they were to possess all of these lands, and even the people in it. He said, I gave you the heathen as an inheritance. Now, a lot of these churches keep on telling us that we're all just a bunch of Gentiles. And then this very small group of people over there that call themselves Jews and Israel, nobody ever thinks about, what about the rest of the tribes? Where are they? And so, my friends, we are cheated out of our inheritance. And just because someone stands up and says that they are the family of God, and they ignore Jesus Christ, they're not devoted to Him and the Christian faith, then why should we follow Him? Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice, and they will not follow another. So do not let anybody cheat you out of, I equate the New Testament as the last will and testament of he who died, the testator, and it says that will does not become effective and we cannot inherit it until he dies, the one who wrote the will. Anyway, so we go back here, and we have to understand the land is from the word erats. Did not Christ say, have I not taught you how to pray, thy kingdom come, thy government will be done on earth as it is in heaven? So anyway, starting with the 5th verse. So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau's mother. When Esau found that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him off to get a wife in Padan Aram, charging him as he blessed him that he was not to marry a Canaanite woman, and that Jacob had gone off to Padan Aram in obedience to his father and mother, Esau saw that his father did not care for Canaanite women. So he sent to Ishmael, in addition to the wives that he had married, Mahalath, the daughter of Abraham's son Ishmael, the sister of Nebaioth. Now, the 10th verse starts out, setting out for Beersheba, Jacob traveled toward Haran. He happened to reach a certain place where he stayed all night. As the sun had set, now, my friend, this is where the translators get busy and do a real number on us, because the rest of it does not compute. All right, where he stayed all night. As the sun had set, taking a stone, he put it under his head and he lay down to sleep. My friend, I can't believe anybody using a stone for a pillow. Then they lead us further down the old mulberry path here, verse 12. He had a dream. My friends, this was not a dream, as we've pointed out in other chapters. The word there, he went into a state of shock. He was dumbfounded. He had a real experience, and he took his body with him on this trip. Listen carefully. He said that there stood there a flight of steps rising from earth till it reached high heaven, and there were God's angels ascending it and descending. As we pointed out to you before, you see a lot of these young, what they call hippie kids, because they got long hair and they're running around, they're wearing an ankh. Now, if you ever studied the Egyptian hieroglyphics, in many of them you'll see the depiction of steps as on a ladder, the bottom or the main part of the cross. And so it represents man's climbing to outer space. And then instead of just the regular top of the cross there, we see a round thing which is called an eye sometimes, like the eye of Horus, as you enter the eye of Horus into the house of Ra. And we've pointed out before how the Egyptians, they talked about the eye of Horus watching them from space in the flying shields. To just go back and review those pages just a little bit, those verses, there stood. He's talking about something that stood there. Something that could cause a flight. Then he describes steps. Once going up those steps into this extraterrestrial ship, then it speaks of rising from the earth until it reached the high heaven. Now, in a lot of cases, we find where they use the word mountain. And then it said that he describes that he saw the Almighty's angels or messengers ascending it, and descending. And it goes on now, verse 13, and the Eternal stood beside him. He's talking about somebody standing beside him saying, I am the Eternal, the God of your ancestor Abraham, and the God of Isaac. To you and to your descendants I will give this land where you are lying. Now, my friends, as I've said before, he was not giving them just certain geographical areas. Now, granted, certain geographical areas were allotted to the ancient Semitic people, as we find hundreds of commandments that they were to remain separate from the different other gene pools that were here on the earth, and he had a divine plan and a purpose in this. But as we said before, have I not taught you how to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in outer space, or heaven if you like. It goes on starting verse 14, your descendants will be numerous as the dust on the ground. Now, my friends, think about that. That is beyond computers, beyond the scope of our imagination. You couldn't even get a readout on a computer as to how many trillions and zillions and billions of people this would be. So if he wanted them to reproduce, and he said that they would, even though it seems like the genetic or the Semitic man, he is at -0 now and has been for a long time. But people don't realize, they don't read the end of the book, they don't stand on and believe in the promises of the Eternal as he's described here, that we will become as plenteous or multitudinous as his promise. And what is the purpose? To inhabit other worlds. So I think this very narrow, egotistical, self-centered belief that we're the only intelligent life on this little globe among trillions and countless planets, I think it's very silly for us to think in those terms. And so, as I tell a lot of people, have you ever gone out and looked up? You shall extend west and east, north and south, and all nations of the world shall seek and bless such as yours and your descendants. I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you go. Now listen. Then he says, I will bring you back to this land. Again, forget land. Erats, this planet. I will bring you back to this planet. I will never leave you till I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke up. In other words, he came out of his shock. We've covered this in another tape. And we've broken all these words down. We've proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt that he came out of his shock. Because remember, it appears here that he ascended to the house of the Eternal. He had gone to this other planet or space station, as I call it. I know that's does not compute, because we have this old, archaic, primitive, religious mindset. And so, consequently, we limit the Eternal. We limit our imagination. We do not use the brains that the Almighty gave us. And so here it appears, after he left in it, and he stood there in this other place as they descended to it, and he met the Eternal, and he promised him that he would bring him back home.
Then Jacob woke up, or he came out of his shock. The Eternal must be here, and I never knew it. He never knew where he was. He was terrified, and he said, "What an awesome place." And this is the very dwelling of God, a very opening into heaven. So Jacob rose in the morning, and taking the stone that he had put under his head, he erected it as a pillar, pouring oil upon it, and he called the place Bethel, God's dwelling, though the first name of the town had been Luz. Now, let's not get mental indigestion. Remember when John of Revelations went there, he called it the New Jerusalem. He called it the city of the Almighty. So now we have a more ancient term than city. It was called a town, and I believe that there was a great student in this Moffat, and he had a purpose in it. Then Jacob made a vow. He said, "If God will be with me and guard me on this journey," in other words, if you give me safe passage back home. You know, what an awesome thing to fly there and to fly back. A man who had never been higher than the back of, say, maybe a camel or a jackass, and here he is in one of the Almighty's great and mighty extraterrestrial ships, and he's flown there, and he goes on to say, "And if you guard me on this journey, and you give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return to my father's house safe and sound, then the Eternal shall be my God, and this stone which I have erected as a pillar shall be God's dwelling, and I will give thee faithfully a tenth of all that thou givest me." Now, we remember what Christ said. Something does not compute here. He says, "Who will build me a house? The heavens is my home, and the earth is my footstool." And as we've said repeatedly, he described to Moses and pointed out that Mount Zion was his home. Notice verse 19, Luz, short for Lucifer or Venus, which changed later as Jacob and others said it was changed to Bethel, meaning God's house. Also, chapter 2, the 20th verse tells us of being guarded on his journey. The Father's house is Luz, not this earthly Father's house, and his wife came from Luz. So when he told his family that his wife was out of this world, he was telling the truth. Now, we've proved how the translators of English have added the ridiculous word ladder for the angels to ascend and also descend upon, contradicting the theory of the chicken wings on their back. They couldn't believe Jacob's trip. So instead of telling him about him getting over the shock and going on the trip, the same world that John went to, they put him in a ship and had his dream, had it that he had dreamed all of this. Now, my friends, we know that mathematically and scientifically it's ridiculous, a ladder. It's only a symbolism. It's an allegory. As we said, those old onks that they represented in the hieroglyphics, runs of a ladder on it. They talked about how you ascended in the eye of Horus, as the Egyptians described it, the flying shields. Now, if it's true, the old churchy ridiculous theory that these angels come down dressed in bed sheets and they have feathers on their back, then what would they need a ladder for? If you got wings and you fly from heaven to here with big chicken wings, why do you need a ladder? Which is ridiculous. We still have some fakers that tell us what the Lord showed them in their sleep and how they take trips to Chi-Chi Boom Boom Land. They would be taking so many flights of fantasy, or they wouldn't be if they would stay out of some of these pizza parlors late at night. So when Jacob, he went on his trip to the top or outer space, not to the top of the ladder, notice verse 12 and 13, tells us that the Almighty was stationed in that place. In verse 15, he was told while he was there that he would return to the Almighty Yahweh's house, and John told of nations in the future, as we've quoted before, that would flow to it. In other words, fly to it, as he calls inner space, travel to it, the planet of Luz. Then verse 17 tells how what an awesome, wonderful place it was. The translators used the wrong choice of words, calling it terrible. It should have said, like, terrible, frightening, exciting, a trip and a wonder to behold. Now this verse also tells us that this trip was Yahweh's, this place he took the trip to was Yahweh's house. In verse 18, he must have been going into one of the 12 gates that was spoken of by John in Revelations, and Jacob says this was the gate to heaven. Now we know that when translators don't know what to use to understand what's going on in outer space, going in and out of some great space station or mount or one of the other descriptions of these extraterrestrial ships, they just throw in a generous proportion of heaven. Now, it's worth noting that our scientists of the Apollo space program, they speak of launch windows that are called the windows of heaven. There's a right time to launch a space rocket or probe to outer space and to set forth the celestial time clock set millions of years ago. There are periodic time slots when the planets, our scientists, they find they're in a proper alignment for a launch through space windows. And just recently here, we sent out a space probe to Venus just at the right time, or they would have had to wait for 2 more years or another proper alignment. Now, a lot of people probably think at this time that I'm all wet because we get so many conflicting opinions and stories from these scientists. I noticed the other day on TV where for a while they told us that they were amazed at how flat the surface was, and the other day they had all kinds of hills and mountains on there. But they were not things that they had photographed. It was something they'd fed into a computer. Now, that doesn't bother me of what they want to call hills and mountains. It just, it could even make more sense to me that when this thing, like in time of Joshua and the time of Sodom and Gomorrah and the time just before the Passover, when the children of Israel left Egypt, as I've maintained, it will again, as Ezekiel talked about, it'll intervene in the last days, and it'll be used in bringing about the destruction of the Almighty's enemies when he starts raining down these large hailstones. So if they are stacked up in certain areas of it, when it passes over, that portion of them will be dumped on certain areas of this planet to bring about the destruction of our enemies. It'll come in here as Revelations described it. We spoke of it before. It breaks down into an army of 200 million. Now, this is beyond the scope of our imagination. There's never been such a large army assembled at one time to descend upon the Christian nations, or sorry Christian nations as we are. But nevertheless, the Almighty planned it, He purposed it, and He will do it, even if our mind cannot conceive it. Now, it was from one of these visits to the moon that we find that the astronauts, they quoted from the Bible Genesis 1-7, and here are a couple of points on the windows and their timely opening. If we believe the Bible and its scientific, astronomical accuracy and its chronological order, which we could still follow, we might know ahead of time when all of these calamities are to befall, or now to some of us it'll be calamities. So like the Messiah said, his sword is two-edged. He says, one edge to some people it brings them life, and to others it brings about their destruction. So it just depends on which side of the sword you're going to be on. Again, we overlook in Genesis 7, chapter 11-12 of the King James, and it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, in the same day were all of the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain, which was up on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we will discuss this later on in another chapter that I've promised you I've been excited about. I've researched on it for months and months, and I hope to present it and upset a lot of people, because I myself, I went along for a long period of time, but a lot of people do not realize the account of the flood that we find in Genesis is the Babylonian account. And we don't know who it was in Babylon for sure that put this account together. It was a watered-down, erroneous version that was diametrically opposed to the true account that we find written in the Chaldean, which we know is one of the ancient Aramaic language. But if we go along with this, it appears, though, that something came through one of those windows and hovered over the area, causing, well, let's say it was rain for the so-called 40 days and 40 nights. And Genesis 8 and 2, it tells us the fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Now, as we're going to show you later on, it rained all right, but what was it figuratively that rained down out of the heavens? And I believe that I shouldn't be getting into this, but we will prove conclusively, those who will have the intestinal fortitude to examine it with an open mind and put aside that their total life of commitment to a mindset that there is a possibility to what we believed is erroneous. I know it's very hard when someone steps on your religious toes. I've broken every one of my toes, things that I choked on, because I said this is diametrically opposed to what I believed as north is to the south. But the reason that I had to change my mind was because in the light of new evidence that was irrefutable, and it really made more sense than what churchianity had crammed down my throat. Note that there was something from heaven or outer space that stopped the rain. We check in Isaiah 24:18-23. It tells again of the windows being open and a worldwide interference. But I think that we were going to find that this is something that came from ancient antiquity, and it was not even referring to this world. And I think if those that will have the nerve to go along with me will be able to prove that conclusively. Pardon me. As in Windows in verse 18, it doesn't speak of using rain, but it will be Venus crossing our path, and or the return also, possibly, of what some have spoke of, like the missing planet of ancient antiquity, the mystery of the one that disappeared, called Marduk. Verse 18, and it shall come to pass that he who fleeth from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he that cometh up out of the midst of the pit shall be open in the snare, for the windows from on high are open, and the foundation of the earth do shake. Now this is talking about in our day. Well, those of us that should live to see this awesome sight. And I believe that it's just a very few short months or years in the near future. Now, the saints of the Most High, their world's not coming to the end. It's the adversary. Now, verse 19, the earth is utterly broken down, the earth is clean dissolved, and the earth is moved exceedingly. Sounds like a lot of rocking and rolling. Some great earthquakes, as it says in other chapters, and tells about the, well, anyway, it describes it right here in verse 20. And the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage, and the transgression thereon shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall and not rise again. It's talking about the adversaries of the Most High. Verse 21 goes on to say, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. And they shall be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and shall be shut up in the prison, and after many days they shall be visited. Then the moon shall be confounded, and the sun ashamed, and the Lord of hosts. Now listen closely, this 23rd verse. When the Lord of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. In other words, it's showing you, look here, here's the two different names, but it's one and the same. There's heavenly Jerusalem, there's heavenly Mount Zion, and then it describes it, and before his ancients gloriously. Think about that. What a great, awesome, unimaginable, glorious sight as the Almighty comes in the very house or space camper, shall we call it, that he travels throughout space with his great host of incubated sons and daughters who are on the inside. Like Job said, he came forth from the womb of the morning and the bosom of the Father. And he talks about those that were inside this holy city that cried to be released, that they might flow out like mighty rivers to the four corners of this earth and bring an end to all of this abomination that's going on this planet. Well, my wife and I just this morning, we were watching one of these as we rose early and turned on one of these travelogues, and it talked about and showed how all the animals of Africa, due to drought and things brought about and change in climate by the mismanagement and the constant raping of nature by man's greed, we find the scriptures truly coming to pass when it says that all creation is groaning in travail, waiting for the glory that shall be revealed in the sons and the daughters of the Most High. And then, as we have described before, and a lot of people don't understand, where it says the hope of glory is the Saviors that shall come forth out of Mount Zion. Those that we spoke of, like Job, that they're groaning in travail, just like the people here on the earth, that they want to be released, they want to leave, and they want to come back to us. Now note in verse 23, it's speaking of the crescent moon, which in my opinion is the combined Muslim world, the ancient Ottoman Empire that is coming again to bring judgment on this reprobate Christian. And then we find the sun here. In my opinion, this represents the Asian nations. And there are other gates and windows in Scripture that mention that we have not quoted here in the Hebrew for window from Strong's Concordance. Excuse me, if you care to look it up. This word 699 is spelled Arubbah, and it's pronounced Ar-Obba. And it says partly from 692, as if for lurking, a lattice, by implication a window. Now listen carefully, like a dovecot, because of the pigeonholes, chimneys, which in its apertures for smoke sluices with openings, chimney windows. Now, in ancient times and even in Europe today, we see these things up over the chimneys. It looks like doors all the way around where the smoke doesn't go straight up, where it goes out the sides. That way keeping rain from coming down the fireplace and putting the fire out. So he's talking about something great that's lurking out there, and something that's going to fly from these holes, like implied by pigeons, or meaning birds. Then we're referred to 693, that they were ambushed by extraterrestrial personage. We have the word A-R-A-B, and it's pronounced Arab, a prime root meaning to lurk and lie in ambush, or ambushment, lay, wait, or lie in wait. Now let's examine some possibilities of the meanings of this gate to heaven, which we will see that Christ told Nicodemus that only those that came out of heaven can return there. Was he speaking of those who were to be rulers in the government of the Almighty? It seems quite apparent that the four streams that flowed out of Eden, or paradise of the third heaven, it represented four different races. Three of those that preceded the Adam man, possibly by hundreds, thousands of years. We can't be sure of this, but as we search some possible thoughts on the gates, we go back through astronomical records of the ancients, even before the Hebrew accounts of the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Chinese, and the Americas. We find the strange so-called planet Venus appearing and disappearing from view of Earthman. Why does it come and where does it go? And why does fire come out of it, making it appear as having a fiery beard, as the ancients described it, also with horns of fire coming out of the top of it? Now, here we have the translators. They misunderstood the word gate as implying navigate, as we believe Strong's Concordance describes a pillar of smoke by day and as fire by night, and it's a great space platform. Ezekiel and John both give us a clue to measure its size, not understanding that the pi times r squared, which is called Enoch's circle, is called the divine circle. It was a thing that was shown this ancient, great, outstanding prophet of God, who, like Elijah, who never saw death, the one that was described as seventh from Adam. Now, I believe that if we had mathematicians who used these measurements, and they understood the ancient system, which, my dear friends, was not this corrupted, polluted, degraded metric system that was brought forth in the days of Napoleon, and we could give a whole long lecture on that, how Again, a part of the adversary. They decided, like Scripture says, to pervert times and weights and dates and measurements. Used many times for ill-gotten gains, but also to corrupt the mind of man and his proper thinking, and causing him to lose exact dates of ancient historical things. Therefore, if he didn't understand the past and how to measure those with proper mathematics, how could he ever understand and know what is to happen in the future? So, my friends, this was not by accident. It was all with a plan and a purpose. But if they had these measurements and they understood them, and they understood that the ancient sacred cubit before even the Egyptians corrupted it by, 3/4 of an inch. They came up with 24 1/4, but the ancient cubit was 25 inches. But if our scientists understood this, and if they would possibly take heed to me, who they think is a kook, I'm sure, but if they were to measure the size of Venus, then they could get something pretty accurate, where we've had all kind of estimates from 72 to 7,900 miles. But then that they could measure it in miles and their circumference, and navigation would fit, because it appears that it has been manipulated by intelligence, bringing it close to this Earth as it crosses our Earth orbit, and then leaves the orbit into deep space, as we've shown in the ancient accounts. And so there is too many records. And where did this brimstone, which is rocks mixed with sulfur, that came out of space on Sodom and Gomorrah and is prophesied again in the latter days to happen by Ezekiel, it doesn't just fall out of space. And don't tell me that was just an accidental, coincidental, luckily, that some asteroid went by, because I don't think most of them have a lot of sulfur on them. But anyway, I may not even be around to enjoy the fact to say, ha, I told you so. But Strong's Concordance gives us this word for gate. It's S-H-A-A-R, and it's 8179. It's shakar, and they say from 8176 in its original sense as an opening, door or gate, city door or gate or port. Notice city, like the heavenly city of Revelations that John spoke of. Then they came up with the word city, which doesn't seem to fit. Now, a gate to the city, but remember John and others who were inside of this extraterrestrial city that could navigate to outer deep space. Let us go and see if the ancients gave us a clue. We have to do some backtracking to prove that the real historical meat in the book's called the Bible. We go back to the Spanish Chronicles of the conquest of the Americas. They tell us some very strange tales, which amaze us that these records survive. These include the stories of the Incas, the Tupac, and Yapanqui, Y-U-P-A-N-Q-U-I, who was familiar with some sculptures throughout the Americas. This was especially true in inaccessible parts of Peru. They said that the white man came from the stars, and they created them, and created them in their likeness and the likeness of the strangers living in the four corners of the world. And Christ said that they were strangers and pilgrims in the earth. And here we have earthmen of this world saying saying this, who knew who they were, and they knew who the star people were. Now, these early people knew that this planet and his inheritance was one of the houses of the heavens. They didn't seem to mind living here. They weren't interested in leaving. Also, they welcomed the visits of these ancient starmen who brought them science and knowledge and health, and bettered their life and their living conditions by teaching them how to build canals and lakes and on and on. Now we find evidence of this in many parts of the world, but especially at Marcahusi, Marcahuasi, which was a place that was very much like the one that we described there at near Lake Titicaca at Tiwanaku. But anyway, what did they find here at Marcahusi? where there are symbols of white and yellow and black men, and then they seem to show a fourth race there, which they don't have too much in the way of clues to who this really was, because of the ravages of time and nature and possibly mutilations of later men. But as they describe these white men from the stars that flew over the whole earth and were recorded and left records by all of the different earth races. For example, Professor Johnny Mason of Pennsylvania University, he was a traditionalist, and he admitted that the ancients who left behind all of these mysteries, he stated that they could not accomplish all their feats without the aid of some type of aircraft, especially when he studied the so-called ancient myths or legends of the pre-Inca origin, in which they alluded to the descent of divinity from the Pleiades. Now, I think that we have discussed in our last book, we went into the Pleiades and we went into Orion, and you might want to go back and listen to that and see that these ancient primitive Indians, so-called, and these different races, many of these areas, they have knowledge that we've long lost, we haven't regained, we haven't bothered to look at. And that's why the buck stops here, and I'm presenting it, and hopefully there'll be some very young, intelligent people with computers out there, and they can get together and do a much better job than I have. So my fervent prayer is that I can only be an inspiration to you. Now we find that replicas of these constellations, they appear in Asia and Europe and on the island of Yeu, Y-E-U, in Vandea, V-A-N-D-E-A, and they are dome-shaped rocks which represent the Pleiades as they were seen in the various epics from the 10th to the 7th millennium B.C. Is it not odd that the Greeks baptized them with the name of the 7 daughters of Atlas, and the Titan condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders, and the name comes from the word pleo, P-L-E-O, meaning navigate. The Hellenes, they begin navigation in May, when the Pleiades rose, and finished sailing when they were seen in the Peruvians. Exploring, who went into a forgotten and unexplored area of the country that was called Marcahuasi, Marcahuasi, which is in the highest desert and very windy drought year-round. It's like a moon crater. This is 3,800 meters up in Peru and west of the Cordillera, Cordillera, in the Andes, which are 3 square kilometers of burnout horror that can only be reached by mule. It's another one of these mysteries. Now the professor went there, and he was guided by vague trails and unconnected and fantastic passages from ancient texts and legends. He discovered animal drawings which he believed went back to prehistoric dates from the secondary era, from what he said, from 185 to 130 million years ago, without going into all the things left behind by the ancients. Who were these people, and from whence did they come? A lot of people, they get bent out of shape if you think that there's a possibility that Moses didn't write the first chapters of Genesis, but recorded information passed on from an earlier civilization before Adam kind. Well, a lot of people have us believe this and believe that he learned from books of great antiquity, but I believe that what he recorded and wrote down and learned, that it was from his trip when he went to outer space to the very house of the Almighty on more than one trip, as we've proven. This is where he got his information, just like the book of Job. I maintain it was not written here on this earth, and now granted been added to, but we can't help but wonder about Genesis 2 and 4, where it says these are the generations, which means Athene, ethnos, race, races. He says these are the generations or races of the heavens and the earth when they were created, and the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now we learn of before that in many cases created means dispatched, so we have races of people who existed before the earth. So why was there not a man on the earth millions of years ago? There are ancient writings of the gods, or the Elohim, plural for gods, in your Bible, also the Nephilim, as it's used in the Bible. Now Nephilim also means sons of God as well as Elohim. Now a lot of the ancients said that the Nephilim made earthmen as workers to farm these planets, like sharecroppers. Where it says worship, the word meant to work for. They were implying that there were, well, shall we say, hybrid genetical experiments of ancient men of antiquity. The reason for deviating so far from our scripture back in time, bring it up to the present, is to show that the scientific world needs to be listened to by this present so-called religious world. Now, perhaps old Nicodemus, he had an excuse because he was in the 12th century. Now, do not, all of the knowledge that is accessible to us, does not all this point that Christ was making, that we have people waiting to go to neighborhoods and other worlds from whence they came, and those that want to go to neighborhoods where they didn't come from. Well, the Almighty talks many places throughout Scripture, and I think we've limited to here on this earth. He said that He would put every man back under his own vine and his own tree. And it was, we've seen, not only the Chinese, but our Bibles and the Egyptians and the ancients, they referred to trees in space, family trees, planets. Well, I'm not going to worry about that, and you don't have to worry about me, because I'm not in charge of that. The Almighty is. Now, the Almighty, it seems that He's a segregationist. I know that doesn't set well today with this present society, and a lot of people, once in a while, they like to get up in your face and they say you're anti-Semitic. Well, they don't want to do that to me because I happen to be Semitic. But it's a good word if you just want to, instead of scaring them with a bayonet, you can really scare them by calling them bad names. But it seems that the Almighty, He was a segregationist, and He separated the different races and that He had made, and He stated the fact. He'll do it again. I didn't write the book, but that's the way it reads. Now Nicodemus, who didn't understand Genesis 28, verses 17, also tells us that this was the house of God, and verse 18 tells us that he must have gone to one of the 12 gates which John of Revelation spoke of, as Jacob says this was the gate to heaven. No, we haven't forgotten the great teacher Nicodemus. But he went to lay some we want to lay some background here why this Nicodemus and the preachers never understood John, the 3rd chapter. As we're getting very close to the end of our tape, we're about to wind it up, I want to clarify one thing. I made a slip of the tongue there referring to Nicodemus. Of course, I, as well as you do, understand that Nicodemus lived in the time of Christ, nearly 20 centuries ago. But what we have to understand, the Almighty says, I will love whom I will love, and I will choose whom I will choose. And He said, whosoever shall come to Him, He will in no wise cast out. And I think what we have to understand, that every race on this nation has come from a particular planet or a star, as the ancient would say, from outer space. And I think that we've failed to understand, I myself, for many, many years, that when the Almighty said, I will put every man back under his own vine and his own fig tree. And we want to remind you of the trees of the garden of God. So there was all different types and species of mankind. And the Almighty created every one of them in a very glorious fashion. He had a great plan and a purpose for every nation of people that is upon this earth. And He said when He returns, He'll have His reward with Him. He said He's prepared a place in the Father's house for every one of us. And He said He would put us in our place and we would be satisfied. No, either the preachers or anybody else has a right to say what the Almighty's going to do with them. I know a lot of us claim that we're God's little honeys. But we'll leave it up to the Almighty. And so the purpose of this is that every man on this earth must know and understand, if he's willing to work with and cooperate with the Almighty, the Eternal, that there is a place for him in the Almighty's kingdom. And we must remember, on this earth as it is in heaven or in outer space, because he has a consistent laws and orders that will permeate throughout all of his universe. He's consistent. He said, I am the same yesterday, today, and forever, and I do not change. But I know we have the preacher saying the Almighty changed his mind. He had to do this and he had to do that. And they get confused over the covenants. He did not change a lot of his covenants. He came and made new ones, meaning new agreements with the people, but we fail to understand the old ones and the new ones. So in case you lose your tape, we'll remind you before we go to the next tape, this is Pilgrim Ships, P.O. Box 1086, Lakeview, Missouri, 65737. Hopefully your friend Noah Fredericks signing off for now.